Okay, I'm Lucas Grosman. I'm a law professor at the University of San Andés in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'm also the dean of the law school for 3 years, more or less now.
Lucas Grosman and I have known each other for a long time. We were students together almost 20 years ago. We've had a lot of great times, both in the United States and in Argentina. We've had a lot of long conversations, especially about law. So I decided to call him today and ask him some questions for this blog. I think you'll enjoy hearing his answers.
Yes, our constitution, like the constitutions in most countries around the world, is rich in positive rights, as you say. So, for instance, rights such as the right to health, the right to decent housing, the right to education, the right to welfare. Okay, all those rights have constitutional status in Argentina.
So there's a constitutional right to health care, a constitutional right to all of the other goods that you mentioned. Does that mean that those goods are actually provided by the state successfully?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. In fact, I would think that the correlation between granting a right and enjoying that right is far from obvious. The truth is that gradually courts have been recognizing the enforceability of such rights. And actually health was the first right to be enforced by the courts, starting in the mid-1990s. The courts starting to acknowledge that there's an obligation on the state to provide health care. And so, for instance, if a particular person doesn't have enough money to pay for a certain treatment or a certain drug, the idea enforced by the courts is that the government should be in charge of that, should cover that.
Does Argentina have a system of race-based and sex-based affirmative action in its public institutions, such as higher education?
No in higher education, but actually it does in politics. There's a specific act in the area of elective positions, which says that 30% of those positions should be occupied by women. So that means that 30% of the members of parliament are women.
At your law school, could you establish a program of affirmative action for women, and could you establish a program of affirmative action for racial minorities?
It's an interesting question. We don't have any experience on that, so it would be difficult to predict what the courts would say. In the case of women, well, it would be a weird program because actually, at least at law schools, there are more women than men. Okay, so for instance, at some law schools, the proportion may be 3 to 1 or 2 to 1 even. At my law school, it's probably 50-50. But if, let's say, it was not, and I wanted to establish such a program, I think there would be no constitutional objection because the Constitution expressly establishes the state duty to promote the equality of women even through affirmative action. In the case of racial minorities, Again, we have no experience, so it's difficult to predict how the courts would react. My guess is that in principle there would be no constitutional objection, but we would have to look more deeply into the details to be sure about that.
When you go to the voting booth in Argentina to cast your ballot, what kind of identification do you have to present?
Yeah, you have to present your, what we call the DNI, Documento Nacional de Identidad. That's required in many different circumstances. For instance, to open a bank account, or for many different things you need that. And if you don't have it, you have a problem. Until now, when you vote, a seal is put on your national identity card, and at one point there's no more room for seals, because you voted too many times, through different elections, and then you need a new one. Okay, you need a new identity card.
Can two men or two women form either a civil union or contract a marriage in Argentina?
Yes, actually they can get married. There was a recent law passed, I think it was this year, or maybe last year, I don't remember, but yes, they can. Well, okay, I was an antitrust commissioner for 2 years and an advisor to the Secretary of Competition for another year. And I taught antitrust law on several occasions, and still part of my research agenda refers to antitrust, especially in Argentina. Antitrust law in Argentina is very different from the American model, not because of its content, but I would say because of its importance. It doesn't play the major role it plays in the US, where it has shaped the way of conducting economic activities. In Argentina, it's by no means as important. It plays a secondary role, even marginal, and that's perhaps more clear nowadays because the government now in office does not truly believe in competition. Instead of trusting the market to regulate pricing, a state official would prefer to have the different representatives of major corporations in a given sector sit down around the table and discuss what the proper pricing or what the proper price should be. There's an old law from the Peronist era that allows for for a very important degree of price control, but there's a legal discussion before the courts now on whether that law is enforced or not. But the more important controls are informal ones. So what would happen is that the Secretary of Commerce gets directly involved in calling the representatives of different corporations and trying to persuade them not to increase prices.
How does he persuade them?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure what are the precise words he uses, but let's put it this way. He's been pretty persuasive. We have an inflation rate that, according to private sources, is around 25%. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the national agency in charge of measuring inflation has lost any credibility and is actually stating that inflation is much less than that. But as I said, nobody believes them anymore. It's been intervened by the authorities, and any neutrality that they had has been completely lost. Now it's being manipulated for political purposes, and part of those purposes is to convey the idea that inflation is lower than it actually is.
Could you imagine a law that would pass constitutional muster that would make it a crime to state publicly or to publish the argument that inflation is substantially higher than official government reports suggest?
It's interesting that you put this question, because actually actions have been brought against private consultants who made precisely that claim. And the argument by the Secretary of Commerce was that those consultants were actually deceiving their clients and imposed fines on them. Those fines were challenged. So the issue is still before the courts, and at least in one case, the courts have said that that was not legal, that the Secretary of Commerce could not do that. But as you can see, there are obvious free speech implications, because what the Secretary of Commerce is doing is restricting the ability of these private consultants to give their opinion on what the actual rate of inflation is. Some people in the government are pushing for re-election. The thing is that the current president, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, has already been re-elected once, and the Constitution only allows for one re-election. So in theory, that's it. She should step down at the end of this period. But some people in the government or in the ruling party want to amend the Constitution so as to permit for a new re-election. No, one is immersed in the institutional context of one's time. And since I'm pretty pessimistic about Argentina in general now, I cannot but feel pessimistic about its law too. I think that the populism permeates all areas of culture, including law. And I think that to some extent we are victims of populism in the area of law. We have populist laws, and that means that laws are tending to promise things that actually the government is not able to deliver. And I would guess that that trend is likely to deepen.